So now the next question.
Yes.
Okay. Where do you think Russia and Ukraine is going? Do you think that the speculation of World War III being an actual probability is something that's legitimate and should be entertained? Or do you think that that's ridiculous and this will not escalate to that point? James, begin.
The fact that you have Russia that has nuclear weapons is of course going to be concerning, but this is fundamentally, you need to look at what is Putin's motivation and goal. That is going to drive the direction of the Ukrainian war as a whole. Is it simply to stop the United States expansion into Eastern Europe? Is it because he has a pipe dream of restoring the Soviet Union? Is he actually ill and that's why he wants to accomplish something before he dies? It all comes down to what is his motivations for the war, and at the end of the day, nobody really knows. And
isn't that terrifying?
That is terrifying, but we can look at their actions and see the direction that they're taking and kind of make conclusions or at least remarks and guesses at what their motivation is. And one of them being that the fact that Russia and like just they seem to be rational actors at this point, and the fact that there's been cohesion even in the high levels and in Putin's circle that actually do know him leads me to believe that there isn't a nervousness around the use of nuclear weapons. And I don't think that, and the fact that the United States isn't very concerned about the use of nuclear weapons makes me feel like, no, it is never going to escalate to that point.
You know where the issue is? A month before the Ukraine war started, every analyst was saying, oh, there's no way Russia would invade Ukraine.
The United States admitted that Russia was going to invade Ukraine.
Like a week before they invaded.
Yeah, they said Russia's invading Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. But 2 months earlier, you ask anyone, they're like, oh, no, it's not going to happen. He's not that crazy. And that's the problem. Like, I agree with you that the public sentiment around World War III starting soon is overblown. In my eyes, it's more of like 1%, 0.5%. But then again, guys, we are talking about the end of the world. We need to realize that even if it's a 1% or a 0.5% chance, we need to sit down and be like, hey, what are we doing? This is the end of the world. Yep. This is not I will risk 0.5% the world ending. No, you don't do that.
You don't do that.
And that's why I believe that, yes, you can't let Putin do whatever he wants. I agree on that point. But we need to keep in mind that we do not want this to escalate. And if the price is giving him something for him to be able to go back to his people and be like, hey, I got something. I am not a loser. That might be a price that we have to pay, unfortunately. It might be. Whether people in power are going to have that insight and the intelligence to acknowledge something like that, and the balls to be able to go back after all the propaganda that the Western world has pushed, to go back to their people and be like, oh, we let
relentlessly stand with Ukraine at any
to go
cost.
back, and even if Ukraine loses 1%.
I've been seeing Biden's tweets recently. Have you seen them? It's like complete. Like he is. Like every single tweet is him doubling down on him standing with Ukraine at absolutely all costs.
Yeah, but that also has to do with re-election and not. The reason for that is there is a possibility that the Republicans win, and you want the United States' stance to be so intertwined with the support of Ukraine that the Republicans like backpedaling on that would lead to a disaster politically.
Oh my God! But now we're talking about the failures of democracy. It's like incentives are no longer pure. They're no longer aligned. You behave in a way not in the best interest of your country, but in the best interest of yourself, in what's going to increase the likelihood that you get re-elected, even at the cost or even at the risk of creating Armageddon.
Like, but the whole point is like, for the defense of democracy. You have to understand that the reason why Biden wants to make sure that the United States never leaves the war in Ukraine is because Russia completely winning the war in Ukraine would be disastrous on a global level. It would collapse a lot of the world economies. It would lead to huge food problems because Ukraine and Russia together are responsible for the majority of the grain supply in the world. It would lead to Russia geopolitically being at a point that in terms of its geographical disadvantages being mitigated against NATO, it just would be disastrous for the Western world.
I have a question for you, James.
Yes.
I would like to know what your opinion is on, well, if because we can agree that the Western world knew the importance of Ukraine.
Yes.
And they knew that if Russia was able to gain control of Ukraine, they would be an immense power,
Yeah.
and we do not want them to get to that point. I think we can all agree.
Yes.
Why is it then that they kept pushing and pushing and pushing and forcing Putin into a corner in a way where he felt like he was forced to invade Ukraine?
All right.
Because that's his narrative. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. You never know what to believe in politics, but if anything, like, why even introduce that risk? If there was, before the war even started, if there was some way for us to sit down and be like, okay, we will not let Ukraine join NATO, but at the same time, you do not invade, and it's just in the middle.
Yes.
Why was something like that not?
All right. I think I'm not sure about this, but I think the idea of like the Ukraine not joining NATO. Also, you need to understand that the minute that you can bully NATO into not accepting a nation under the threat of war, you completely circumvent the purpose of NATO, which is to protect these countries from war.
I agree, but I think it's quite clear why Ukraine is a soft spot. I think it's quite clear because that they act as a
But
buffer.
You need to.
And I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it's not Russia bullying NATO into not accepting certain countries. It's just a specific set of exceptions that we should all mutually agree on to not touch.
like, I
Because if
believe
you
that
don't
it's-
accept, if
those
you
are
don't
different
accept,
things.
if you don't
Same-
accept Ukraine, that means you can't accept Finland. And if you can't accept Finland, it means you can't accept Sweden. It's like, why would those countries be any different?
But why would you not just discuss it with Russia to come to some sort of
Okay,
agreement?
you also understand that there's what Ukraine wants and what they want.
Who cares? Like, I mean, realistically speaking, at this point, it's not Ukraine calling the
Just
shots.
tell
It
them
never
no.
was. Yeah, it
You
was
wanna
never
join
Ukraine
NATO?
calling the
No.
At
shots.
the end of the day, I do think that there was an idea put forward that Ukraine would not join NATO, but they would join the EU. That was a point that was...
Oh, Ukraine was never in the EU.
No. They put a bit...
Okay.
It's going through the process right now to join the EU.
Interesting. I
Because
didn't know
EU
that.
has no military, like...
Sure, and that's fine.
stipulations. Yeah, but I think that idea was
yeah.
put forward. But there's a part of me, and just knowing the United States' history and their idea of how they conduct like foreign policy and the way that CIA works, there's a part of me that thinks that the United States wanted Russia to invade Ukraine.
Yes, I believe that deep
Yeah.
down. I agree with you.
I think
that's
that was- 'cause-
that's what I was trying to get to. In that,
Mm.
yes, on the surface, you look at it right now, Russia is the bad guy, and I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
You just do not go and invade your neighbor. No one will ever condone that type of behavior.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we're following the line of thinking that Putin is a madman, then we'd expect the other person who's not a madman, which is the Western world,
Mhm.
to be a bit smarter than that.
Yeah.
To try to avoid getting to that position.
Any provocation
to de-escalate.
at all.
Yes. And that's my problem. It seems to me that no one on the global scale is talking about how do we end this war.
But you need to understand that Russia was in Ukraine before Ukraine even put forward the idea that it was going to join NATO. Russia was in Ukraine in 2014,
Yes.
which was before, like, when Ukraine overthrew
And-
the Russian-backed government and put a government that wanted to join the EU, not NATO, Russia was in Ukraine.
But I think for me, the biggest issue, not the biggest issue, but one that I find kind of annoying to deal with is that for some reason, the mainstream political figures, or whatever the word is, the people that represent the Western governments, I haven't seen, again, maybe you guys could prove me wrong on this or share what you've seen, but I don't see a lot of talk about exactly how we're going to get to a peaceful resolution. I
Exactly,
see
but
more.
that's my
but they
big
have
All
talked
I
about
see
it.
is propaganda about standing
No.
with Ukraine.
No, that's not true.
Oh, that's not true.
Macron has talked like the talk that Mustafa said of finding something to give to Putin, and so that
So
Putin
that's
is
being
happy.
discussed
That
on the
was
world
pushed by
stage by
Macron.
big
Yeah,
Western
yeah,
figures.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
Schultz and Macron both pushed that.
Who's Schultz?
He's the
Chancellor
Andrew
of
Schultz for a
Germany.
second. I
Chancellor
was
of
going to
Germany.
be like Andrew
He's
Schultz.
the Chancellor of Germany.
Okay.
Like this
okay.
idea is being put by rational actors and stuff like
But
that.
that not the
Yes,
US
but it
for
doesn't
some
seem
reason.
like the US is.
And the
Oh,
US
because
have-
the United States is across the Atlantic Ocean. They don't
exactly,
care.
exactly, and
that's
that's
the biggest issue
thing.
because the United States is the one that are basically
No, the United States
pushing
is
almost
the
all of
United
it.
States' idea and political opinion is whatever Ukraine wants, we're going to support that.
But,
But
that's
is
not,
it
that
coming-
can't be true.
No,
that
but-
can't be true because it's clear that countries
But there's
act
a
in their
bigger
best
question.
interest. So why is it in the
Yes.
United States'
Okay,
interest
Ashraf,
to
but
escalate
there's
this
a bigger
war?
question, in my opinion. Is that coming from a place of, are we doing that for the benefit of Ukraine,
No,
or are
not
we
at all.
doing that
Not at
to
all.
weaken Russia?
No, but we're talking about
this is
what their public opinion is, right?
Yes,
Their public opinion of the United States is whatever Ukraine wants, we're going to support that.
yes.
And that's what
Why?
that's exactly the sore spot that I brought up. Is that why is the U.S. pushing so much propaganda about standing with Ukraine?
What were we saying before we were cut off by the
Yeah.
audio
So
stopping?
I was
Why is it red
asking.
It was always red. It's
Was
blue
it?
when you stop.
Okay.
Okay, so I was asking, is the U.S. backing up Ukraine because of their care for the Ukrainian people?
No.
Or because on a geopolitical stage they believe that backing up Ukraine is going to weaken Russia, so that is in their benefit?
Okay.
Because if they're totally acting on an ethical standpoint, which I personally do not believe so, but sure, let's assume that, then I understand why you would back up Ukraine to no end. But the minute you start doing it to beat the Russians, then at that point it's a proxy war.
Yeah.
And at that point you are both, in my eyes, as bad as each other.
So the thing about the United States being, it is a democracy at the end of the day, and the fact that it has so many complicated moving parts means that we can't look at it as a single actor.
Okay.
There is multiple actors in the United States who all have different interests for why they either want the war to continue, not to continue, and so on.
I agree.
You have, for example, as we've mentioned, the military industrial companies that
Yes.
obviously are going to be lobbying in any sort of way, making ads, pushing certain officials to back the war so that the war continues.
I agree.
Ukraine flags in their bio.
It's just so that they can continue selling Javelin missiles, HIMARS systems, Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Not selling them directly to Ukraine, but selling them to the United States government that then gives them to Ukraine.
Yes.
Then you have, for example, the financial institutions that are the ones that provide United States loans.
Yeah.
Because the United States has provided substantial loans to Ukraine that then have to be paid back after the war with good interest rates and so on. They have a vested interest for the Ukraine to continue needing financial assistance. And then you also have the different individual politicians in the United States that might have good ethical reasons and non-ethical reasons for wanting to back Ukraine and will push for Ukraine to be backed. Then you have Joe Biden, who has to deal with all these actors, also what he wants and the United States' best interest, and so pushing whatever he wants to push. And so you have all these different actors. Then you have the CIA that has its own goals. You have the United States military and the Pentagon that wants their own goals. And so you have to look at the summation of all these goals, and that'll drive the United States' policy. And at the end of what happens is that the United States wants a protracted war in Ukraine that draws Russia, that makes it spend all its military resources, that shows the ineptitude. Because at the end of the day, this is a comedy special for the rest of the world. Russia's inability to close off this war against Ukraine. And not only that, it shows all the holes in Russia's foreign policy and alliances, because Russia's military ineptitudes have caused countries like Kazakhstan, like Armenia, like those eastern countries to not have faith in Russia's military capabilities and geopolitical capabilities and to start distancing themselves. China is also loving this because it is tying Russia more and more economically to China. It is forcing Russia to weaken its military. Russia and China, like all the TikTok warriors and YouTuber specialers that go in and say, yeah, Russia and China would fight the United States. They don't work together.
Yeah.
Russia and China have never liked
Yeah.
each other. They don't have the same goals. China wants to take half of Russia. They want to take the East. They don't work together. They don't want each other to win. China is loving a weakened Russia.
I agree.
And so you have to understand that right now, it is the best case scenario for the United States. We are going
Yes.
through the best case scenario for the United States.
But doesn't that reveal the theatrics of it all?
Exactly.
The fact
That
all
I
this
was waiting for
propaganda
you
is-
to give me this response, because I was going to respond to that by saying, well, then maybe wouldn't it have been better for the Ukrainians if the West did not help them fight back and their cities were not destroyed, their homes were not destroyed, their factories were not destroyed, and then it would be up to them to stage a revolution. But the minute the US starts giving them more and more resources to fight back, the more adamant the Russians are on destroying them and fighting back. So it's
You're
just
also asking
really,
a group of people to lie down and let
But-
themselves
but by
be
the way-
invaded.
I'm not saying they should lie down. The Ukrainians have a right to fight back, and they will. And if you believe in the ineptitude of the Russian system, then you believe that the Ukrainians will be able to fight back and win their sovereignty back.
I don't know about that point. That point, you're losing me there. Like, to expect the Ukrainian people to win back their sovereignty through revolution is kind of a stretch. I don't understand that. Like, it makes a lot of
It's
sense.
really hard to
It makes a
control
lot of
30
sense.
million people.
No, like
Ash.
my point is that if you're trying to preserve the sovereignty of the Ukrainian nation, then it does make sense. It does follow logically that you would support them fight for their sovereignty, which is exactly what they're doing right now. Like, I mean,
But-
the fact that they need aid and the fact that this aid is resulting in escalation from Russia's military intervention just means that Ukraine on their own could not.
No, but what-
it literally means that
what I'm
Ukraine
trying-
on their own could not be independent or like protect their sovereignty.
But what people do not understand is that Russia cannot keep its military in Ukraine forever. They cannot have 700,000 soldiers stationed in Ukraine waiting for a revolution to start.
But I
They
think-
want to gain control and then remove their military and go back to fighting another war or station them somewhere else. And this is how empires fall. And if you believe that at its core, the Russian system is not that good, then you believe that 30 million people would be able to gain their sovereignty back.
I'm with you 100%.
It might-
I'm with you 100%.
it might take
until
some
that
time.
Last bit.
And on top of that, do you think, like, let's take the worst case scenario of this war drags on for a couple of years. Ukraine's infrastructure is totally destroyed. A lot of Ukrainian people leave Ukraine, are refugees in other countries, and Russia somehow ends up conquering Ukraine.
Mhm.
At that point, does Ukraine even have a chance of
Yes.
gaining its sovereignty?
Yes. And
How?
I'll tell you why. Because the United States and Europe react differently to European countries being completely destroyed than Middle Eastern or African countries being completely destroyed. If you look at Kosovo, if you look at Croatia, if you look at those Balkan countries,
But
you see there's a difference. Like, there's already sections of Ukraine that have already been separated into the different zones that different Western countries are going to fund after the war to reconstruct.
But if the Russians have conquered it, would they fund Ukraine?
Oh, if the Russians win, no, not at all.
Exactly. So at that point, they have no money, they have no infrastructure.
If they lose.
If they lose, so now they're fucked. So
But
if
I don't think
Russia
they're gonna
ends up
lose.
winning the war now after they've destroyed all of Ukraine's
Okay, I have a
infrastructure
question.
and they've lost half their population either to death or they fled the war, there is absolutely no way they would regain sovereignty.
I want to hear this. I want to kind of move this discussion in a specific direction. I want to ask, do you think that it's possible that the United States and its basically, what's the word, like negotiations with Ukraine on whether or not they would be joining NATO, do you think that that was calculated in a way to instigate a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Because as you've discussed earlier, it is in the best interest of the United States government and the United States as a whole for the war in Ukraine to have happened in order to weaken Russia. So do you think that it's possible that this was a calculated decision to instigate this war?
Well, like James said
do you think that
earlier,
they could be that evil, let's
yes.
say?
Look, like James said earlier, the United States is not one person. It's a summation of multiple people and multiple organizations.
But
and
you think the net
Some of them, at least, knew that was going to happen and
wanted it.
Yes, some of them.
Interesting. But isn't the primary the final negotiations, like the final acts or whatever that happened that instigated that war were facilitated by a single actor, single body, the United States government.
But there
and
is
the president of the United States.
no.
Like,
The thing is we need to understand that the war in Ukraine started in 2014. It didn't start in 2021 or 2022. Wasn't it?
whatever. Yeah.
Russia had already annexed Crimea
Okay.
in 2014, and they were already fighting the Ukrainian military in the Donbass, but they were just hiding the fact that they were there. But there was Russian troops in Ukraine in 2014 fighting the Ukrainians. This idea that we need to establish, would Russia have not invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had promised not to join NATO? And personally, even irrelevant and
Say the last
independent.
sentence again. Would Russia have,
Have
sorry.
you, would Russia
Yeah.
have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had publicly stated we are not joining NATO or the EU?
Okay. Yeah.
I think that yes, they would have.
You think they still would have?
Yes.
Long term,
Yes.
not right now,
Okay.
Not
so-
right now.
but maybe
so now
in
you have
10,
vindicated
15
the
years.
Americans with that.
No,
perspective.
not at all. Not at all.
You have.
No, because the Americans.
This was inevitable.
The Ukraine, because the United States could also have, like, if it was inevitable, there's a difference between it happening now or in 4 or 5 years.
What's the difference?
Ukraine's ability to prepare and fight off an invasion, mobilize better, provide like.
These are all technical. I mean, fundamentally, the war is inevitable, is what you're saying. And in that case, the instigation of the war by the Americans wasn't all that
No, but
terrible.
but no, Putin could have
It was an
wanted.
inevitability.
No, but Putin could have wanted to invade, but realized that hey, Ukraine is now too powerful. I cannot invade.
Yes.
If they had time to mobilize their troops, to buy more weapons, to fortify their stations,
To train all their troops using NATO technology, NATO maneuvers, NATO tactics, you need to also understand that, like,
Yes, but all of this militarization and mobilization would have been the thing that provoked the war anyway.
no
So, I
one
mean,
to
like,
an extent, because
I mean, in theory, that's exactly what they were doing by having talks about joining NATO. Like, all of these discussions are what provoked the war. So everything you're describing right now about preparing Ukraine for an invasion of Russia would have been what would have provoked
it's
Russia
not
to invade.
anyone preparing Ukraine. It's the Ukrainians themselves preparing themselves. Don't I'm not
But
saying
don't
that the
you think
U.S.
that
would
at
have
that point
given
that-
them money
But
and
don't you think
and,
at that point then
and
Russia would have
weapons.
invaded? If there was any reason to believe that Ukraine was preparing for an invasion in a way that would make it impossible for Russia to invade
Well,
successfully,
at the minimum,
they
at
would have
that
invaded
sure,
immediately.
that could have happened. But at the minimum now, Putin has lost his only credible argument of why he invaded Ukraine.
yes, public image is huge.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So you're saying that whatever these things that you've just described, let's say just generally, the Ukrainian preparation for an invasion of Russia, if it had nothing to do with the joining of NATO, then Putin would not have been able to justify his
Right.
invasion.
You need to
He
realize
can't justify an invasion
because
based on
the-
Ukraine is getting too prepared.
the only person that
Okay.
Russia was trying, that Putin was trying to convince this war to, or try to convince that was the right time to invade, is Russians. The only person,
and he needed
the-
the talk of the joining of NATO to convince them.
Yes. He needs to convince the Russian people that this cause is worth dying for. How do you take 300,000 men from their families, from their work, from their